And now, a passage from the Southwestern Historical Quarterly from July 1923. The Negotiation of the Gadsden Treaty by J. Fred Rippy. The relations of the United States and Mexico appeared to be approaching another crisis in the spring and summer of 1853. Raids of Indians from the northern side of the international boundary were daily growing more destructive, and Mexico was persistently clamoring for the fulfillment of treaty obligations and indemnity for the depredations which the savages were committing, while the government of the United States was urging that its inability to cope adequately with the Indian difficulty was largely due to Mexico's failure to furnish effective frontier defense, and maintaining that it was not bound by the Treaty of 1848 to pay indemnity for the spoliations of these Indians. The old question of claims, which had been a source of difficulty since the administration of Andrew Jackson, and constituted one of the causes of the recent war, was coming once more into prominence. Difficulties confronted in surveying the boundary laid down by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had culminated in a grave dispute regarding the southern limits of New Mexico, a dispute rendered critical on account of the attitude of the settlers and the authorities on the frontier, and the possibility that the loss of the contested area by the United States would mean the loss of a feasible route for a Southern Pacific Railway. Control of another route was being interfered with, and the construction of the communication apparently delayed by Mexico's nullification of the Garay Grant in Tehuantepec, now in the possession of American citizens who were loudly demanding the protection of their alleged rights. That party which had fought the War of 1846 to 1848 but had not been fully satisfied with the territorial gains it had brought was once more in power with a two-thirds majority in the House and 37 out of 60 senators. Noisy proclamations of manifest destiny were to be heard on every hand, and the more impetuous of the expansionists, filibusters on a far-flung battle line, were girding their loins and putting on their armor in Texas and California. Mexican troops were advancing along the northern frontier, the United States was reinforcing its army in the southwest, and the newspapers of both countries were discussing the possibility of another war. The situation was extremely critical. Would war actually result? There were several factors which tended to induce both countries, at least, to attempt a peaceful settlement of the points at issue. The officials at the head of the Mexican government, no matter how much they talked of going to war, must have known that they were without funds and without equipment, and possibly with no better prospects for European allies than they had in 1841. Moreover, the storm of protest and opposition aroused in the United States by the recent war with Mexico surely had not been entirely forgotten by American statesmen. The Pierce administration and the editors of the expansionist organs of democracy, even if they had been in favor of a resort to arms, must have known that another conflict with Mexico, the expenses of which could only be collected in territory, would not only endanger the solidarity of their party, but even imperil the Union itself. Undoubtedly, a Pacific settlement could be calculated to commend itself both to Mexico and to the United States. Moreover, why should the Pierce administration go to war when there was a reasonable prospect of obtaining everything it desired by purchase? Was not purchase good democratic procedure, and was not Santa Anna, that unscrupulous soldier of fortune, now at the helm in Mexico and much in need of funds to sustain his government? If he could be convinced that a treaty would serve to strengthen his position, might he not be expected to assume dictatorial powers in order to effect it? With the view of pursuing this line of action, the administration sent James Gadsden to Mexico in July 1853. Gadsden was perhaps not a bad choice for the mission. True, he had graduated from Yale without imbibing the first principles of diction or style, and he persistently and uniformly employed high-sounding and redundant phrases whose meaning he did not fully comprehend. But he had gained some little practical experience as a land speculator and a promoter of Southern railways. He had been a nullifier in 1829 and a secessionist in 1850, and he was a friend of Jefferson Davis, sharing all this great Southerner's eagerness for a Southern Pacific Railway and the southward flight of the American Eagle. Moreover, he was a man of considerable energy and persistency. with a fair amount of acumen and with few scruples as to the means of attaining the particular ends he had in view. Gadsden's instructions were much more moderate than might have been expected under the circumstances. After assuring the newly appointed envoy that his government earnestly desired a pacific settlement of the outstanding difficulties with Mexico, Marcy dwelt upon the rights of the citizens of the United States in Tehuantepec, the southern boundary of New Mexico, and the acquisition of a practicable route for a Pacific railroad, release from responsibility for Indian depredations, mutual claims, and means of improving the commercial intercourse of the two countries. The main portion of the instructions was devoted to the boundary difficulty, the railway, and release from Article 11 of the Treaty of 1848. With reference to the boundary, Marcy maintained that the line surveyed and agreed upon by the commissioners of the governments concerned was not final because it did not have the concurrence of the surveyor of the United States. Lieutenant Whipple, who had acted as surveyor ad interim while the line was being run, had been appointed without authority by the American commissioner. The fact that the survey had received the approval of the Secretaries of State and of Interior in no way affected the matter. If the line had been run in accordance with the stipulations of the Treaty of 1848, their approval would not be necessary to its validity. In case it had been erroneously surveyed, no amount of approval could serve to correct the error. Gadsden was therefore to take the stand that the southern boundary of New Mexico had not been established in accordance with the treaty, and to inform Mexico that the United States expected each party to abstain from taking possession of the district in question, or doing any act which would indicate, an exclusive appropriation thereof to itself. Although the late governor of New Mexico had apparently contemplated the occupation of the region, and announced his purpose in a proclamation, he had acted without authority from the federal government. His intention was never executed, his purpose was disapproved, and Mexico had already been notified that the United States would not attempt to take possession of the disputed area. The latter government expected, therefore, that Mexico would take the same course, and it was Gadsden's duty to urge upon Mexico the propriety and reasonableness of the proposal. Marcy declared that the government of the United States was more interested in acquiring a new boundary embracing territory adapted to the construction of a railroad than in establishing its claim to the territory in dispute. He hoped and expected that the most expedient mode of settling the question would be found to be the merging of the boundary issue in the negotiation for the alteration of the boundary with the view of acquiring the contemplated route. In consideration of the many advantages which Mexico would secure from the construction of a railway along the international frontier, Marcy presumed that she would readily accept of a proposition to alter the boundary along that part of the line, ceding to the United States the strip of territory necessary for the proposed improvement. While admitting that it would be difficult to ascertain without actual survey the extent of alteration required for such a purpose, Marcy ventured two suggestions. It would be important, particularly to the interests of Mexico, that such a railroad should connect with the navigable waters of the Gulf of California. For this purpose, it is desirable that the true line, as we contend, the line commencing along the Rio Grande a few miles north of El Paso, should be continued for a considerable distance west beyond the treaty line, then run south about 30, and then again west to the Gulf. Should Mexico be unwilling to make such a large cession of country as such a line would require, she might agree to have the line on the southern border of New Mexico continued until it shall strike the river San Pedro, and thence down that river to its junction with the Gila. With the negotiations for the alteration of the boundary, Marcy suggested that it might be proper to embrace a settlement of mutual claims in regard to Mexican claims for indemnity under the 11th article of the Treaty of 1848. However, Marcy contended that the government of the United States could not admit of any responsibility. It had fulfilled its obligations to restrain the Indian incursions in the same way and with equal diligence and energy as if the same incursions had been committed within its own territory against its own citizens. Since 1848, the United States had kept a large portion of its military forces stationed in the vicinity of the international boundary for the purpose of keeping the Indians in order and restraining incursions into Mexican territory. Better results had not attended their efforts, largely because Mexico had left her border in an almost unprotected state. It would be singular indeed, said Marcy, if the United States could be held liable to indemnify Mexico or her citizens for injuries which she invited or at least might have prevented, and in virtue of being a government was bound to her citizens to prevent. Nevertheless, while denying the justice of these claims, Marcy realized that the offer on previous occasions of several millions for release from the obligations stipulated by the article in question put his government in a somewhat embarrassing position, from which he admitted that he would like to find a way of escape. Marcy assured Gadsden that the government of the United States was willing to pay liberally for these three important considerations, but he did not state definite figures. Moreover, he left the subject of the concessions of citizens of the United States in Tehuantepec open for further instructions and promised later advice concerning the subject of claims in general. The concluding paragraph of Gadsden's instructions dealt with the commercial relations of the neighboring republics, describing the situation in a few brief sentences. The unsettled condition of affairs in Mexico for many years past has very much diminished our trade with the country. The constantly occurring political revolutions there rendered commercial intercourse unsafe. The frequent changes in her tariff and the severe penalties for the noncompliance with it, even when imperfectly promulgated, was vexatious and often ruinous to our merchants. You will make known to Mexico the desire of the United States to establish with her intimate commercial relations on liberal terms. Such relations would in every respect be advantageous to both countries. Whether the moderate views set forth in these instructions constituted a true representation of Marcy's attitude in midsummer 1853, it is difficult to say. They certainly did not satisfy the ambitions of the agent to whom they were addressed, and who, perhaps disposed to conform to the desires of the Secretary of War, appears to have had little notion of confining himself to the modest aims set forth therein. On two occasions before leaving the United States, Gadsden urged that A.B. Gray, who had been connected with the boundary survey, be employed to explore not only the section in the vicinity of the disputed area, but also the Gulf of California and adjacent regions, for, said Gadsden, any settlement of the boundary question which may involve a change from that defined, or rather so undefined, in the Treaty of Guadalupe, should be made so discreetly and advisably as to preclude the necessity of a revisal hereafter. We must settle on a zone which will give satisfaction to both parties, preclude neighborhood feuds by securing to the state what she requires, and as you probably know, she will have. By the beginning of September, after having been in Mexico City only 3 weeks, he had evolved a philosophy of Mexican revolutions, reached a definite conviction regarding the motives which uniformly actuated Mexican statesmen, and begun a series of urgent appeals for more complete and liberal instructions with reference to the amount of territory to be acquired. The wars of independence at the beginning of the century had not achieved liberty or democracy, he said. They had merely achieved independence from Spain by an alliance between the Church, the native Spaniards, and the Creoles, none of whom cared anything about freedom, equality, or popular government. They had been interested in the people solely as subjects of plunder and exploitation, and they had soon fallen upon each other because the spoils had not been sufficient to satisfy the greed of all. Thus the army came to be employed as an instrument of tyranny, thus despotism sustained by a military force which remained loyal only so long as it was well paid and well fed, sprang into existence. All of this had a very direct bearing upon Gadsden's mission, and the early days of September found him far from pessimistic as to the outcome. The Mexican treasury had shown a $17 million deficit during the last fiscal year. The people who possessed ready cash were shipping it out of the country. There was little prospect of borrowing on the credit of the Church. Rents and internal revenues would come in too slowly to meet an emergency, and yet there were numerous signs of an approaching revolution, and Santa Anna's army must be paid or lost. Would not these factors appear to justify the acquisition of more territory than originally contemplated, the 5 frontier states, for instance? If Santa Anna's immediate necessities should become extremely pressing, would it not be wise to place at once into the hands of the despot a portion of the sum to be offered? How large was the contingent fund of President Pierce? How much money would the United States be willing to offer for these frontier states? These were some of the questions propounded by the enthusiastic agent of Manifest Destiny. Moreover, in his most sanguine moments, Gadsden rejoiced at another possibility. Santa Anna might be overthrown by the moderates, and this group would perhaps tender the whole country to be annexed hereafter under our constitutional requirements as states of our federation. At the crisis, how should your minister act? His instinct is to receive and protect. Such was the situation as Gadsden saw it soon after his arrival. In succeeding dispatches, he reiterated most of the opinions expressed in this private memorandum and gradually unfolded his plans and the methods he proposed to pursue in order to consummate them. While confessing his repugnance to despotism, he was not averse to lending it financial support provided his ends could be gained thereby. He condemned bribery on general principles, but when it was clearly the only means of accomplishing a specific object, he was willing to make use of such appliances, to resort to the ancient franchise to apply the oil to the axle, covering the action of his government by working through the medium of the agents of Slew or Gray, rivals in Tehuantepec, for instance. He believed also in the efficacy of intimidation, urging repeatedly that the troops of the United States on the frontier be augmented and that vessels of war be sent to the coasts of Mexico. But his stock argument was, of course, that of Manifest Destiny. An adequate conception of the difficulties and vexations which this apostle of expansion confronted, and of the methods which he employed, cannot be had without a somewhat detailed study of his dispatches. These will show the philosophy of young America at its most aggressive stage, while they will reveal at the same time some of the fundamental problems of the period. On August 31st, Gadsden complained that the exaggerations of the American consul at Acapulco with reference to alleged outrages committed upon the captain and crew of the schooner B.I. Allen had involved him in an unnecessary correspondence with the Mexican government. He referred at the same time to the increasing disposition on the part of lawless trespassers to disturb the tranquility of the frontier, and concluded his dispatch by deprecating the practice followed by his predecessors of interposing diplomatically in the interest of private claimants prior to the consideration of each case by a competent tribunal. On September 2nd, while advising Marcy with reference to the choice of consuls for Mexican posts, he declared that it would be better for the commercial relations of the two countries to dispense with all consular appointments unless Americans of character and capacity, well informed on the obligations imposed by their commissions, could be secured. He said that the high duties and prohibitions imposed by the Mexican government tended to foment smuggling and contraband trade, in which Americans frequently participated. And when they became involved in difficulties with the Mexican authorities, they invariably sought the protection of their government. Unless American consuls exercised firmness and discretion in such cases, they were likely to commit their government against the law instead of in its support. 2 weeks later, Gadsden went still further and indicted the entire consular system of the United States as applied to Mexico. He charged many consuls with being ignorant of the Mexican code and of Mexican port regulations. He said that they too often combine with and become the partisans of those who have incurred responsibilities in the violations of this code and these regulations, more than 9/10 of the issues on private claims arising from palpable disrespect of the law. The diplomatic contest in which Gadsden was for several months to be a not unwilling participant began in the latter days of August with a complaint from the Mexican Minister of Foreign Relations, Manuel Diaz de Bonilla, with reference to excesses committed by Americans on the Chihuahuan frontier, presented an opportunity, perhaps in line with his policy of intimidation, for conveying the information that the recently appointed governor of New Mexico had been accompanied to his post by a military force sufficient to cope with the problems in the region. This note and rumors to the effect that 2,000 American troops had been sent to New Mexico led Bonilla to make an uneasy inquiry as to the significance of the movement, whereupon Gadsden responded with the assertion that they had been dispatched for the purpose of assisting the governor to preserve order on the frontier.